One case
Two interpretations.
and one question.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. Welcome to Two of a Crime. Okay, let me ask you a question. If someone told you that they were pregnant, would you believe them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What if they showed you ultrasound photos? They had baby showers, they did gender reveals, nursery photos, due date updates, like they were keeping you abreast of like the whole thing, like especially like on social media, like if you didn't know them. Yeah, right? Me too. I want to start this a little differently. Why do people fake pregnancies? Okay. It's like a good question, right? So a couple of reasons that doing research I kind of came up with was relationship preservation. So like you want your relationship to stay. Fear of abandonment. So some people have like these legitimate fears. Attention and validation, financial motives, and identity and belonging. So it's a realm of things that like could be the reasoning that somebody would like fake a pregnancy, if that makes sense. But I want to talk about one thing that kind of came up while I was looking into this, and it's the difference between a false pregnancy that someone believes and faking a pregnancy. Okay, so pseudocyesis is a false pregnancy that a woman like actually believes. So she has like all of the symptoms of like a pregnancy. So she may be having like missed periods, weight changes, regular what you would expect to see with pregnancy symptoms. Even like you can see like when you look into it, even physical body symptom like changes. So like you gain weight in your stomach, or like just these weird things that like normally you'd only see with pregnancy. Versus, of course, like we're talking about here, is like deception. So this is the intentional misleading of being pregnant. So one thing that I want to mention that is just wild to me is that this isn't the first time that this has happened either. So there are many cases actually. So in 2004, a lady named Lisa Montgomery did the same thing. 2015, a lady named Danielle Lane did something very similar. So there are other places that you can look us up. I know we talked about while we were researching this week. Even there was like a couple couples who have faked pregnancies. They didn't go to the lengths that these people did, but even just like faking these pregnancies and pushing them out like online as if they were actually happening. So that leads us to Taylor Parker in 2020. And I know that this is a big one right now, especially with Netflix documentary coming out. But the one thing that I want to identify between Lane, Montgomery, and Parker that are similar in these cases: the social deception, escalation over time, and the desire to maintain this lie. So you can see it escalating over time as they are having to figure out how to maintain this lie that they have started. Okay, so who is Taylor Parker? What everybody believed, right? Taylor Parker is expecting a baby. She's building a family. She's planning for the future. She seemingly has this ordinary life. Before we get into like really the deception part, I want to talk about just who she was in general. So Taylor was living in East Texas and was in her late 20s. She's in a relationship and had built what at least seemed like this ordinary life. To other people around her, she wasn't introducing herself as someone hiding secrets. She was introducing herself as an expectant mother. And that's important because this story doesn't begin with a crime. It begins with a pregnancy that investigators would later determine didn't actually exist. So at this point, nobody around her knew how significant this all would become.
What even happened? I don't know the story.
Okay, I'll tell you the story. So essentially, what happened is Taylor was dating Wade, and about 6 months into the relationship, she said she was pregnant. And she's doing these gender reveal parties, she's planning for it, she's doing all of these things. And when you look at the case, there's a lot of other criminal type activity that she was trying to do, like purchasing millions of dollars worth of property and stuff like that. And she was saying she had these rich um, family members that didn't actually exist. She was actually keeping up with, I believe, around 30 aliases. So she's keeping up with all of this, like pretending to be these people. Um, there's a lot to the story when you start looking at it.
And the boyfriend was into this too?
He had no idea.
Okay, I was right.
So on October 9th, Taylor goes to Reagan's home early in the morning and essentially takes her baby. She's pulled over on the side of the road on the way to the hospital, and she has the baby in her lap and the placenta still attached. So she essentially is saying, I delivered this baby. I need to get to the hospital, whatever. Well, come to find out, when she gets to the hospital, they run like HCG tests and stuff like that. And none of this is coming back and saying that she was ever pregnant. So this is where her web of lies essentially starts to crumble. So she gets there. They finally do a vaginal test, and the doctor's like, she did not have a baby. Like, there are things they can look at. And it comes out later, she actually had a full hysterectomy. So there was no way she could have had a baby or been pregnant because she no longer had her uterus. And I believe that she even had cysts or something on her fallopian tubes, or like something like that, and even had to have like the fallopian tubes removed. So she couldn't have even had a, what's it called, like an ectopic pregnancy. Because sometimes you can get pregnant and it'll be in your fallopian tube, and that's really dangerous. And they'll have to go in and they'll have to remove it. But she didn't even have fallopian tubes. So, like, they knew that wasn't even possible. But Taylor had cut everybody out of her life who could have told the people in her life this. So she had cut her mom out of her life. Her mom wasn't really in her life. I think later they talked to her and she said, no, Taylor's known for lying. Like, she does this, whatever. One of her past friends said they were concerned, but it wasn't really their business, and nobody ever thought that it would go to the lengths that it went to. So on December 20th of the same year, 2020, the grand jury indicts Taylor for capital murder and kidnapping. January the 22nd of 2021, prosecutors announced that they are going to seek the death penalty. In March of 21, Taylor is indicted on a second count of capital murder and ordered to be held without bond. So she can't be bailed out. April 21st, the court sets a 2020 trial date. In December of 21, the defense seeks a venue change, arguing that pretrial publicity made a fair trial impossible, basically, where they're at.
Wouldn't they have figured out, though, that the friend was murdered, like, and didn't have the kid, and couldn't they run DNA tests on the baby?
Yeah, eventually they would have run all the tests. That I think Taylor thought she could get away with it. She's thinking, I've got this baby. Everybody already knew I was pregnant. Why would anybody question it? Why would anybody ever? But why? Like, her and Reagan were friends. Why would they not think? I don't know. I think she was probably manic at that point, because she knew that her and so that's one thing that you'll see whenever they're talking about the before. They kept the people in her life that knew that she couldn't have kids. They were like, oh, it's getting closer and closer to the due date. Like, she's gonna have to fake a miscarriage sometime because she doesn't have a baby. The baby's not coming. And in fact, I think it was the hospital that was associated with the OBGYN's office that she went to. They put out what they call a pink alert. So that is to tell them you have to be extra cautious because you have the potential of a baby being snatched. So they were expecting her to show up maybe at the hospital and try to steal a baby, but I don't think anybody ever think someone they know is capable of this heinous crime. I mean, it just absolutely heinous. And that's why they ended up going for capital murder, is because the method, she performed this C-section, if that's even what you can call it. She cut in behind the uterus. It flipped the uterus over. I mean, ultimately, Reagan died. The baby died. I mean, it's awful.
The baby died?
Awful.
I thought it was alive.
Baby died too. I assume, I'd have to do more research, but I assume because she took the placenta too. Well, when you're unattached from your umbilical cord, that's when they start breathing. But if the umbilical cord and the placenta are no longer in the body, they're not getting the oxygen that they normally get from mom's body. So I would say that the minutes start counting down, even if the whole thing's removed from the body, the baby's not in the sac anymore. It's not getting anything that it needs. It's got to breathe. So if the baby's not breathing at that point, and I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't really know, but I would say if the baby's not breathing at that point, you're in trouble because they're not getting oxygen to the brain because they're no longer getting what like they normally would get from mom's body. Thank you for pointing that out. All right. So this is where the story begins with the pregnancy claims. So again, we're kind of backing up before the crime, and we want to talk about kind of the timeline that happened before it escalated to the rest of it, like where the crime occurred. So over time, Taylor began telling her friends and family that she's expecting. And as the moments passed and the story expanded, there were these social media updates, photos, conversations about the baby, plans for the future. To the people around her, this wasn't just something that she mentioned once, right? Like it became part of who she was. So now she's like identifying. And that's important because the longer that something continues, the more believable it becomes. So people don't generally expect someone to maintain this kind of deception over months and months and months. So instead of questioning it, people kind of just accepted it. Because, normally if there's a ruse, like it's over quickly and then it just kind of goes away and, oh, that was weird. But like it doesn't, to maintain lies like this over time, wild. Okay. I want to just kind of talk about building belief is what I'm kind of calling it. And this is kind of how she built the trust and ended up where she was at. So this wasn't one announcement. It was a story that continued to grow. We kind of said that. As investigators later reconstructed events, they found examples of like the pregnancy narrative expanding over time. And it's being reinforced. So this included, like we said, like the public updates, photos, private conversations, preparation for the baby. They had like a whole nursery, and other actions that appeared consistent with someone who was like expecting a child. The important thing here is that it wasn't any single event. It's the pattern. Because if somebody posts a pregnancy picture, that doesn't necessarily convince everyone. But if there's months and months and months of updates, conversations, preparations, and everybody around you is treating it as a real pregnancy as well, it becomes much easier to accept the story without questioning it. We naturally assume that people are telling us the truth unless we have like a reason not to. Most of us don't question what our friends tell us. We just trust them. And that's why I think these people believed her, because it's not that they're stupid. Of course not. They're human. So we're kind of noticing here that nobody's asking Taylor to prove that she's pregnant. So this is where the perspective kind of changes. So we're seeing like conflicting views here. So perspective becomes extremely important. What people saw was a pregnant woman, someone who's excited about becoming a mother, someone's making plans, someone's behaving in a way that seemed completely normal. Like that's how you would expect me to act if I were pregnant. But investigators eventually looked at something and it looked very different. They weren't just looking at what was visible, they were looking for what wasn't. So, like, kind of what's happening behind the scenes. They started examining inconsistencies, hidden behaviors, contradictions, information that people around Taylor didn't necessarily have access to because they're now digging into all this information. So, here's the question, okay? Ask yourself, would you have noticed? Or do you only notice now because it's over? It's the ending. You know what happened. You know the story. Were the warning signs significantly obvious, or do they only seem obvious now that we know how the story ends? And we're going to talk about that later. But basically, hindsight. You always say hindsight's 2020. It always has a way of making everything feel inevitable, and that's exactly where we're going with this. And we're going to come back throughout this case to that point. This is when the story changed. For months, everyone around Taylor was building one version of events. Okay, you have this one version of events that we believe to be the truth. Investigators would eventually begin building another. So using evidence instead of appearances, factual versus theatrical, for lack of better words. So the investigation moved quickly. Investigators started gathering this evidence. They began reconstructing not only what happened that day, but everything that was building up to it. Okay, so digital evidence doesn't have emotions. It doesn't forget, it just simply records. So investigators started examining like online searches, messages, location data, social media activity, communications with Reagan. They weren't asking whether one message proved anything. They were asking what complete digital picture was shown. So one text message rarely tells the whole story. You have to look at the pattern. So digital evidence told the investigators where to look next. Next, we're going to talk about behavioral evidence. Behavioral evidence is often some of the most persuasive evidence, and also sometimes the most easily misunderstood. So people naturally will ask, what would an innocent person do? But behavior isn't always that simple. So instead of asking whether someone's behavior looks suspicious, should we instead ask what behavior can actually tell us? And what are we actually just assuming rather than being told? So behavior gives us context, essentially. It doesn't automatically tell us intent. What we're saying here is behavior helped investigators know what questions to ask. Unlike behavior, physical evidence exists whether someone lies or not. So the physical evidence essentially helped investigators test those questions. So what questions do I ask? Let's frame those questions and then let's answer them. And that's like the process that, they're going through. Physical evidence doesn't rely on interpretation in the same way. It either exists or it doesn't. Investigators combine physical and digital evidence and witness testimony to build the prosecution's case. So I want to talk about deception versus planning. So at what point do you go from you're just deceiving people to you're actually planning? So I want to put this on two sides, and I want to talk about like the voices that are used and just the context of this happening kind of in real life. So with deception, it's direct, energetic, and takes responsibility. Okay. It's used for storytelling and strong arguments. So an example might be Officer Miller made an arrest. Whereas on the planning side of things, it's more formal, objective, evasive, used in like scientific reports or when the doer is unknown. So, for instance, an arrest was made. So I saw that a lot when I was writing my dissertation because we had to stay more in like a very formal writing. So it's all about the way that I guess it's perceived and the way that it's being said. Again, think of the difference between like scientific versus storytelling. Sometimes when you're writing something, you have to be very scientific in what you're saying. So you cut out a lot of the things that may be more elaborative, and you end up with like a more direct story. So let's pause. We've talked about deception, we've talked about the investigation, and we've talked about the evidence. But our podcast isn't called Two of a Crime because we simply retell stories. It's because we want to talk about where the interpretation actually begins. So, how does our brain fill the gaps from the information we're given and come up with like the conclusions that we end up with? So, here's today's gap. Were the early warning signs actually obvious? Or do they seem obvious because we know the ending? Could the people around Taylor realistically have known? At what point does deception become planning? All right, before we end today, I want to change the lens for a moment. Throughout this whole episode, we've kind of talked about were the warning signs obvious or are they only obvious now? And there's a name for that tendency, and we call it hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is our tendency to believe that events were more predictable after we already know the outcome. In other words, once we know the story, our brains begin to connect dots that didn't necessarily seem connected at the time. So instead of asking, how did nobody know? Maybe we should be asking, would we have known? We asked that a couple of times. So that's the interpretation gap. The evidence hasn't changed. The lens through which we're looking at it changed.